Now, I do admit that sometimes I get a little bit confused about how much fans enjoy backstage drama in wrestling, because ultimately, that is just a wrestler's place of work. Like, I'm sure you have an office. Some days you turn up and you look at Steve in accounts, you're like, man, I hate that Steve. He's an asshole. Then you just say, oh, hi, Steve, as he walks on by. But if that's the kind of noise you're into, I am happy to give you the juice, because hello, I am Simon Miller. Welcome to What Culture, and that's right. Here are 8 pairs of pro wrestlers that even today may not like each other because they've got beef. Number 8, The Undertaker and Hulk Hogan. This is why Mark Calloway's post-career as a podcaster has been so damn interesting. Before all of this, if you had said, Simon, do you think The Undertaker and Hulk Hogan liked each other? I'd have been like, well, they're both old school guys, I'm sure they're just fine. This was not the case though, and it goes back to the 1991 Survivor Series when they were working together at the pay-per-view over the WWF World title, and I'm sure you've seen this clip over and over again. The dead man picks up Hogan to give him the tombstone, he drops him onto a steel chair that Ric Flair had pushed in there, and we got one of the biggest shock wins of the early 90s. Then, after the fact backstage, Hulk said to Undertaker, oh my gosh, you really got me there, brother, insinuating that his neck and head had hit the canvas, and the Undertaker, being a young pup and brand new to the WWF, basically had a meltdown. He had just cooked the cash cow. Now, Mark Calloway has talked about the fact that he was so ashamed with himself because he prided himself on being a good worker. And of course, it was 1991. It wasn't like today, where you could just go on the internet and see this footage. So a few weeks later, when it was broadcast and the Undertaker saw it, he realized that, to call a spade, Hulk Hogan had totally lied to him. And from then on out, he realized you probably shouldn't trust Hulkamania because, my gosh, it runs wild. I mean, why Hogan decided to exaggerate the whole thing, I don't know, but do not forget, The Undertaker was worried about losing his job, as you would do. Again, let's go back to Steve and accounts. Let's change him into the boss. If you accidentally throw coffee over him, well, you're probably going to start packing your bags. Then you realize you never did this and it was just a dream. That's a terrible analogy. This all came to light when the Phenom was asked about the fact that Hulk Hogan got booed on that premiere of Raw on Netflix. And he basically said, well, what goes around comes around. I think that sums it up. Number 7, Ric Flair and Eric Bischoff. So this was literally happening when Ric Flair was still a star on WCW Nitro. He felt like Eric Bischoff didn't respect him, and if he could kick him out of the company, well, he would do that as soon as he could. It then turned into lawsuits, with Ric Flair going to watch his son play college sports, and Eric Bischoff saying, man, you have to come to work, so we never gave you the time off, and Ric Flair saying, you did give me the time off. Do you remember that promo he cut when he went mad and started elbow dropping his jacket and saying, fire me, I'm already fired? It was in direct relation to this. It may have been one of the best promos ever, but he was pissed at Eric. They then, of course, both found themselves in WWE, and do not forget, on that night that Eric Bischoff walked out and hugged Vince McMahon, nobody else backstage knew this was going to happen, to the point Vince even said, listen, I just hugged the guy, so if you do have any beef, you throw it under the bridge now. I don't want no funny business. Obviously, Ric Flair heard this and went, well, I'm not going to listen to you, and I'm going to do my own thing. As the story goes as well, Eric and Ric Flair did go into a room when Arn Anderson guarded the door, and the Nature Boy will tell you he landed a few punches on Eric Bischoff, whereas Eric Bischoff is like, that's not true, that didn't happen at all. So I imagine the truth is somewhere in the middle. Vince didn't care about any of this though, so he laid down a marker and said to Flair, if you ever do anything like that again, I will fire your ass. I'm not 100% sure this beef has been squashed either. Anytime Ric Flair does talk about his former boss, well, he doesn't seem best pleased. Number 6, Scott Steiner and Ric Flair. And this is exactly how Scott Steiner feels about the Nature Boy. And my gosh, Scott never held back. You can go watch WCW Nitro from the 2000s, or the year 2000, and nearly any time Steiner is in the ring cutting a promo, he would just go off on people he wasn't even feuding with, and he often went after Ric Flair. One of the most infamous interviews he ever did is when he started saying that Stone Cold Steve Austin and the WWF were better than WCW, and the reason he wanted to criticize World Championship Wrestling was because of that 53-year-old who had more saggy skin than a puppy. He was referring to Ric Flair, and if you're wondering why the Nature Boy wore a t-shirt on the last ever episode of Nitro, well, it's probably thanks to comments like this. He also called Ric Flair an ass kisser, and that WCW sucked because Scott Steiner was unhinged. And I guess the company kind of played off by this because we had the Millionaires Club taking on the New Blood, which was essentially Steiner versus Ric Flair. That is also some of the worst wrestling TV you will ever see in your life. Arn Anderson even talked about this on his podcast and said he thought this dated back all the way to 1991 when Scott and Rick had a match, and Steiner felt like Flair had basically sandbagged him because he didn't want him to get over. Even in 2022, he was saying stuff like, if I ever see Ric Flair, I will beat him within an inch of his life. So I think we can say this one with a lot of confidence. These two do not like each other. Or Scott Steiner's not like Ric Flair. Number 5, CM Punk and Tony Atlas. So you really should Google CM Punk telling this story because it is totally weird and goes back to a time when CM Punk was the WWECW World Champion. And when he heard that Joey Mercury was leaving OVW, the developmental territory, he went down there to have a 6-man tag, because why the flub not? Before all this, he did bump into Tony Atlas, though, who was doing some kind of a seminar, and Tony told him, listen, man, you don't want to take your wrist to that degree, because it looks like you've got a broken arm. You may never get on TV. So, of course, CM Punk stood there looking at him going, well, I am on television, and I'm also a champion. Now, Punk has always said that he responded very politely to Tony Atlas because he realized he was a legend. And then later on, when Tony was giving everybody some advice, he was like, you shouldn't be an asshole. And he looked directly at CM Punk. So CM Punk, being CM Punk, responded by going, are you calling me an asshole? And Tony Atlas was like, yes, I am calling you an asshole. I told you to take your wrist tape off, and you said no. I mean, this is the dumbest argument ever. Now, Punk went out there and made everybody know that years later they did shake hands and put this under the bed. But at the time, you can see why he would be a little bit worried. It was when management talked to stars and stars talked to management, and anything could derail your push. I mean, that happened to poor CM Punk anyway, but I get it. Number 4, Steve Austin and Jeff Jarrett. This one was super interesting because we did see it play out on TV. Once again, I have good news because in 2022, Steve Austin and Jeff Jarrett did a podcast, and now they're all good. It all went back to the Memphis territory, though, when Steve Austin started his career, because promoter Jerry Jarrett, who was Jeff Jarrett's dad, was notoriously cheap in paying his talent. There is a story by Dutch Mantel when Jerry Jarrett was doing a meeting with the wrestlers and said, I want you all off steroids, and Dutch went, listen, bro, you don't pay us well enough to eat and get food. No one here can afford drugs. I mean, that sums it up. Austin would back this up as well because it was during a time he would tell everybody his diet was just tuna and potatoes because he couldn't afford anything else. So one night after a show, he was looking at his check, probably contemplating his life. How on earth is he going to survive off this? This is when Jeff Jarrett walked through and said to Steve, you can look at it as long as you want, but it ain't going to get any bigger. I think Austin took that as an offence. It got worse because after he cut the Austin 316 promo, Jeff Jarrett made it very clear that he thought this was blasphemous. So in 1999, when management said to Steve, how about you work a program with Jeff? He was like, I ain't doing that. And he walked out on TV and he dropped Jeff Jarrett with a stunner. And that was the whole thing. It lasted 5 minutes. But essentially, Steve Austin was being an elephant here because he never forgot. Now, actually, I don't think that program would have worked anyway because it really wasn't what the fans wanted to see. But again, who cares about that? It was almost 30 years ago. What makes me feel well better is that today, they are at the very least on talking terms. That's what you want because life's too short. Number 3, Chris Jericho and MVP. So this one does seem to be confirmed by at least one of the wrestlers involved because they've talked about it. But at the time, Dave Meltzer came out very strong that this absolutely happened. He doesn't usually do that unless he has a very specific source. As the story goes from 2022, Chris Jericho and MVP had already fallen out on the internet when they found themselves in the same room. So MVP went up to Chris Jericho and asked him if he'd like to step outside. Jericho got in an elevator and he pushed the button while saying, I don't fight jobbers. And as you can imagine, that made it a lot worse. There were witnesses too that said this absolutely did go down. Of course, soon after this, they would both find themselves in AEW. But if we are to believe those reports, they both went into another room and they actually sorted it all out. This one feels legit to me as well, especially when you are talking about MVP and Chris Jericho. It goes back to Steve once again. They must have found themselves in this position time and time again, especially in WWE. It's better to just make it water under the bridge. It does seem like it stemmed all the way back to Chris Jericho asking MVP if he'd like to be on his cruise, though. And MVP was like, nope, I don't agree with your politics. And we'll just leave it there, but I'm sure you can figure it out. Number 2, Shawn Michaels and Hurricane Helms. So I will admit that I'd never heard about this one, but I'll let you into how my What Culture Wrestling freelance work, which is a stupid sentence. They send me some ideas, then I go do a bit of research, and yep, this actually happened. Who the flub knew? Now, it's only fair to make out that Shawn Michaels and Hurricane Helms are totally fine today, but back in 2010, I can only imagine somebody sent Hurricane Helms off because he did a bunch of tweets essentially going, that's Shawn Michaels backstage. He never cared about anyone, and all he tried to do was bury everybody else. And to be honest, I didn't like it. Now listen, Shawn did have a reputation for all of that, and I'm sure he'd be the first person to admit it because he'd done it time and time again. When actually Hurricane Helms had one of his first children, and there was some complications. Back on social media, somebody sent this in the way of Shawn Michaels, who just replied saying, I'll pray for him. And I think when Helms saw that, as well as the fact that he was a dad, he realised that wrestling is the most important of the least important things. And what a lovely thing for another human being to do. If they squashed the beef, they drew a line under it. I think it was the right move. Number 1, Sin Cara and Simon Gotch. So we are not going to do Simon Gotch and Enze Amore, because if you know, you know, and you can just go on YouTube and you will learn all about this around about 47,622 times. So we will talk about the time that Sin Cara, or Hunico, who eventually stepped into the mask, decided he didn't appreciate Simon Gotch, so threw a Diet Coke can at his head. Now, Simon talked about this on a podcast, because essentially their whole relationship was throwing verbal barbs at each other, when he realized, oh my gosh, this Hunico is very sensitive. I've probably gone too far. This meant one day Sin Cara number 2 did just throw a soda can at Simon Gotch's head. He was obviously annoyed when he turned around and Hunico was running at him. He double-legged the guy when they got into it, and I think that Simon Gotch gave him a bit of a choke. Now this calmed down quite quickly, because I think both dudes understood where the other guy was coming from, and Gotch even said to Hunico after this, you've got really good aim, because the damn Diet Coke hit him right in the eye, and it covered his clothes. If you've ever been doused with any kind of liquid, you know that absolutely sucks. Now, I'd actually go as far to say that's dangerous, because, you know, if you did get some can in your eye, that can't be good for anyone, but nobody is blind, but thankfully we don't have to talk about it. I can reopen my eye. Not many other wrestlers that genuinely hate each other. Make sure you're super nice about this in the comments, and remember that it's just life. Before you like the video, share the video and subscribe, and you can click the video on the screen and I shall tell you some more tales about some tellingful wrestlers. Otherwise, my friends, I appreciate you joining me today, and make sure you have a terrific old day. Apologies for my voice, it is totally strained. That's the nature of the gig. I will still see you on the next one.